Hello, citizens, and welcome back to Histories and Mysteries Redux Genesis, Part 2, the class about sustaining creation. If you missed Genesis Part 1, go ahead and find it on YouTube. And of course, I know, I agree, but it's me, Bill Burris, again. Histories and Mysteries Redux are classes that I've already presented at the church at one time or another. I've modified them a bit to help make them more friendly for this online environment. And in this case, Histories and Mysteries Part 2, I'm covering two classes from the section of classes I taught called Histories and Mysteries Genesis. These are the two classes that deal with creation. So let's pretend we're back at the church. So go ahead, grab a caffeinated beverage of choice. You're probably going to need it. Pretend it's Woody's Fair Trade Blend. That's pretty good, Joe. Take a seat in the back of the classroom in good Presbyterian fashion. Look to the whiteboard. It's on the left-hand side of the classroom there for the terrible dumb joke. There it is on the bottom there. Yeah. Ooh, yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Because this is a Christian education event, we're going to have some passages from the Bible that are at least relevant to what we're teaching. So this is from Psalm 104, verses 14 through 21. You cause the grass to grow for the cattle and plants for people to use, to bring forth food from the earth, and wine to gladden the human heart, oil to make the face shine, and bread to strengthen the human heart. The trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests. The stork has its home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats. The rocks are a refuge for the conies. You have made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting. You make darkness, and it is night, when all the animals of the forest come creeping out. The young lions roar for their prey, seeking their food from God. This is the much dreaded agenda for this particular class. Of course, we're going to have the opening prayer. We're going to go through some caveats and disclaimers, a couple concepts, a couple issues that are related to creation, and then we're going to talk about the care of creation, that is dominion versus domination. So, the opening prayer, if you know it, say it with me. Dear Lord, even though Bill is teaching us, may we please learn something of value. Amen. Okay, here we go. Super small voice, caveats and disclaimers. The goofball is pretending to be a Sunday school teacher, is a geologist, specifically an environmental and engineering geologist with very strong, albeit mixed opinions, like concrete or something, regarding environmentalism and environmental activism. Well, I know. Here we go. There's going to be geology here. There's just nothing you can do to avoid it. If you're going to start talking about this kind of stuff, you're going to talk about geology. So let's look at some concepts related to creation and sustainment. Where was the Garden of Eden? According to Genesis 2, a river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is Euphrates. Well, that's interesting. Where are some potential locations for the mythical Garden of Eden? Well, one of which is actually in the area of northern Syria or easternmost Anatolia or northern Iraq. Here, I'm going to use the little pen marker here. Bear with me. And that is right at the area, kind of the headlands of the source area for the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here's the Tigris right here. And here's the Euphrates working its way down through Mesopotamia. This is one of the locations that seems to be indicated by that description because there's the Tigris, the Euphrates, and you got a couple other rivers that are going the other direction from this area that maybe have been candidates for the other rivers mentioned. Others argue, though, that it's down here where the Tigris and the Euphrates kind of used to combine before reaching the Persian Gulf. This part of the world now, in what we now call Kuwait or Iraq, or that portion of that part, the headlands of the Persian Gulf, has changed since ancient times. The Persian Gulf used to be higher up, but over millennia of silting, the Persian Gulf has actually gotten smaller and the land gotten bigger. But anyway, here's a location that has been argued because of these other rivers, the Cheopsis River and the Ulai River, kind of all getting together. So maybe that's a location for the mythical land of Eden. Creationists would argue that we can't know where Eden was, that the flood changed the surface of the earth, and so the location of Eden was simply wiped out along with everything else, like with the dinosaurs. So let's talk about the flood for a moment. Can we talk about rainbows? Let's start with Genesis 9, starting with verse 11. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. Now, this is my opinion, me, Bill's, but is this God's promise not to wipe us out with natural disaster? In other words, some natural disaster, giant flood, super volcano, whatever it may be, is not going to wipe out humanity. Okay? In other words, a natural hazard that we as a species have been promised by God not to be wiped out again by a natural hazard. That's the question I ask. Is that the case? And that's kind of my belief, that this is God's promise, that we are not going to get wiped out by a natural disaster, a hazard, so to speak. And I use that word hazard very specifically because of the man pictured here. This is Dr. Leonard Palmer. He was one of my graduate school teachers at Portland State University. He was much grayer than he was in this picture. I found this picture much later. This actually turns out Dr. Palmer was working on that Mr. Cooper, who jumped out of the airplane with all that money back in the 70s. Well, he was the one, Dr. Palmer was on the team that was looking at the sedimentary deposits in the river system where they found a bunch of that money, trying to figure out how old the sediment was, where C. Everett Cooper had dropped all his money there, or his money had ended up. Anyway, I speak of Dr. Palmer because he used to argue that there was no such thing as a natural hazard. He would argue that as soon as you put mankind in the picture, that's what creates the hazard. Otherwise, it's just a natural event. It's only a hazard if human beings are involved. And follow me here as I move on. So, for example, are there such things as acts of God that kill people? So let me talk about the boulder first and the earthquake. This is during, oh goodness gracious, I want to say 1992, 1993, when I was at graduate school in Portland, Oregon. We had an earthquake in southern Oregon. It was a minor earthquake, but it had dislodged a boulder, and that boulder had come tumbling down the mountain and squashed a pickup truck. And inside the pickup truck was a father and a little girl, and either they were on their way to church or coming back from church. I can't remember which. But anyway, it was just, freak of luck that And people are, oh, why would God claim these church-going people, especially the little innocent little girl, so on and so forth, this act of God. And that's how it was kind of portrayed in the media, that maybe God was calling back this little girl for some reason or other. It's just a sad tragedy, an act of God that this earthquake occurred and this boulder fell down the hill. Well, at the time, I was working with a group of folks called the Association of Engineering Geologists, and we're very much tied up in engineering geology, landslides, rock falls, and we did not see this as an act of God. We saw this as a failure by human beings, not because that little girl and that man happened to be in that truck at that moment, but at that place. That somewhere along the line, mistakes were made, miscalculations were made by human beings on where to put that road, how the road cut was made, what situation had left a boulder to sit precariously on a place where it could roll down onto the road and present that hazard to drivers, and such that a relatively small earthquake could dislodge that rock. Instead, we did not see this as an act of God, but as a compounding of human events that led this to occur. We had presented the hazard, that it was no longer a natural hazard. It was a man-made hazard. In other words, if human beings are knowledgeable about a potential hazard and have the ability to stop it, either by design or activity, or do something to stop it, then is it at any time anymore a natural hazard? Is it no longer an act of God? And so astronomers argue that, hey, there are asteroids out there, and they're going to smash into the Earth. Eventually, at one point in time, an asteroid's going to hit the Earth. Maybe it's a really big one, and it's going to cause an extinction-level event. Is that an act of God? Or is it not, when you've recognized that it could actually occur and have the potential to take steps to prevent it? Just something to think about. All right, there are no natural hazards. So, what about self-inflicted disaster? What about we do things to our own environment that creates a hazard to us, and we completely... It can't be God's fault if we're the ones who are doing it to ourselves. Which shifts nicely to another concept, and that's ancient climate change. This in turn will tie right back again to this Garden of Eden thing that I was talking about just briefly a few minutes ago. Turns out that there are multiple lines of evidence that indicate that the Sahara Desert wasn't nearly as large a desert as it is now. In fact, desertification of northern Africa is a major issue on current climate change, as the Sahara Desert just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So presumably it was smaller in the past, and we have several lines of evidence that indeed the Sahara Desert was much smaller, and there is this belt of lush savanna running through the desert area, of what is now desert area, Desert Sahara. And one of the ways that we know this is because we can actually find cave paintings by ancient peoples who actually depict the animals of the region, and it's all savanna animals. The area was much wetter than it is now. So I ask you, just like the last time in the last class where I talked about Cain and Abel being a potential metaphor or analog between the strife, the warfare between pastoralists in the hills and the steppe and civilized farming folk down in the valley, and a cycle of warfare that occurred there. Could it possibly be that the Garden of Eden is actually a reference to some section of northern Africa that was once more lush and then became desert, forcing the people to move out? It's just something that I'm asking. It turns out we have another record of ancient climate change, at least in the Middle East, and that is the Dead Sea itself. This is an amazing record of climate change all across the Levant, or what we call Palestine. Okay, and I'm going to use my little pen here to help indicate, because here's the current shore of the Desert Sea in this photograph right here. Now I want you to look, and you can probably just see these striations or lines on the hill here. These are strand lines. These are ancient shores where waves from the lake had eroded into the hillside. In other words, at times in the past, the Dead Sea was much, much deeper, much, much higher in elevation than it is now. And we can see evidence of climate change by the changes in the Dead Sea level. The Dead Sea is an evaporative sea. Water comes in, and the only way it comes out again is through evaporation. There's no outflow from the Dead Sea, hence the reason the buildup of salt there. So in the past, it's also been called the Salt Sea or the Asphaltus Sea because of asphalt or bitumen type oily tar that used to form there. So we got the Gulf of Aqaba, and from that area in Egypt extending up into Israel, right across the Judean hills. So everything on the West Bank. Anytime there's any water that falls on here in the form of rain, up in the Golan Heights and Syria down into Jordan, that water will flow eventually into the Dead Sea, and the only way it comes out again is through evaporation. So during wet times, when the climate was wetter, the influx of water was greater, and as a result, the Dead Sea would rise because it would not evaporate as quickly as the water coming in. And so you'd have higher levels for the Dead Sea. So high levels of the Dead Sea indicate wetter times. And then at other times, the Dead Sea would dry up or get lower as the overall level of moisture in the air or the climate change. There's less rain, and as a result, the Dead Sea gets lower. So let's take a look at some points here. You got this point right here, the high at around 2000 BC, and then it takes a sharp dive to a very, very low point at around, this will be interesting. We'll talk about this here. Now, near the end of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, you got a low point, and then it kind of bounces up. And then right here, this is interesting. Here, right around 700 AD, is when the Arab invasions occurred, when the Arabs swept into the area as a result of everybody converted to Muslims, and they raided their way and invaded and conquered all of the Middle East, North Africa, all the way to Spain, and worked their way out towards Iran and out into Iraq and into the steppe. So this great spread of the Muslim religion, the Arab invasions that spread across the North Africa and the Middle East. It's interesting that we see at about this time a change in the type of sediments that come into the Dead Sea. And it also coincides with a period of drying right about this time. But the change in sediments are specifically in pollen, where the pollen that shows up in the sediments at this time start changing from a more temperate type of plants to a much more desert type of plants. And at least this has in part been attributed to the Arab invasion, where the Arabs, the Bedouins, the Arabs are big into goat herding as a main form of economic sustainment, how they sustain themselves by herding goats. These goats, of course, will go down and eat down all the foliage and increase desertification. And as a result, maybe this part of the world became more desert-like as a result of the Arab invasions. Now, the last thing I want to focus on is this tremendous drop in sea level that has occurred just in the last, say, 20, 30 years, this precipitous drop in the Dead Sea. And in fact, the Dead Sea level, this was at 2000, is actually lower than that now. Let's go back to 1177, or the time between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. We call this period the Bronze Age collapse, and the year 1177 is often kind of associated with this. And is this Bronze Age collapse part of the Dead Sea narrative, or is it captured in the Dead Sea narrative? Because we saw that precipitous drop in Dead Sea levels from 2000 BC to around 1000 BC. And around this time is when it was getting very close to its lowest time. And at the same time, we have what we call the Bronze Age collapse. The Hittite Empire collapsed. The capital was demolished and burned down. This is the capital, Hattusa, right up here. Many, many cities in northern Syria were burned or destroyed at this point of time. All of the Minoan civilization out in Crete was destroyed at this time. The Mycenaeans in Greece were wiped out at about this time. The Egyptians were being invaded by groups of people they called the Sea Peoples into northern Egypt. And there's great disruption all throughout the area. Just major disruption. And people have often, scientists and historians have looked back and wondered whether or not climate change might have been a driving factor for this. That as a result of certain lands drying up, people have started migrating, resources become more scarce, ratings, all this kind of stuff. Maybe that we're actually seeing evidence of climate change associated with the Bronze Age collapse within the sea level drop of the Dead Sea. So let's take a look at the modern level. So I got 3 photos here from 1972, 1989, and 2011. And the Dead Sea has been dropping for 3 reasons. One is the area in the region has been getting somewhat drier over the last few decades. That might be a natural system. But one thing that is not a natural system is the amount of water that is used in the Jordan River, which flows from the north into the Dead Sea here, is now barely a trickle when it comes into the Dead Sea, because so much of the river is diverted up above for drinking, for agriculture, so on and so forth. The water is being taken by more and more people north of the Dead Sea prior to the Jordan River flowing into the Dead Sea. So that's one reason why the Dead Sea is getting smaller. The other reason is to the south of the Dead Sea is in the expansion of evaporation basins. More and more evaporation basins are being constructed. Then you let Dead Sea seawater flow into the evaporation basin, and then it evaporates, and you have Dead Sea salt, which are in high demand right now in cosmetics and other materials like that. And so that's a second reason why the Dead Sea is dramatically getting lower and smaller than it has in the past. Now this dramatic change, fast change in Dead Sea levels has had some really adverse impacts in the areas immediately surrounding the Dead Sea. One of the major consequences is land subsidence. As the lake has shrunk, the Dead Sea has shrunk, the actual land around it has started to subside and collapse. There's multiple reasons for this. I don't want to have to go into poor water pressure and things along that line, but as you take away the Dead Sea, the groundwater gets lower and lower as the sea gets lower and lower, and as a result you're going to get some degree of subsidence. Add to that Dead Sea water in the past has put a lot of salt into the actual soil, and when natural rain occurs, and the rain that falls, it doesn't happen often, but when the few times that it falls, it actually trickles down through the soil. It'll take that salt away and then reduce the strength of the soil. The salt crystals aren't there, leaving void spaces, and this too can lead to subsidence. And so what I ask you is the Dead Sea a potential allegory for what's happening to us across the entire world? In other words, there are natural systems in place. In the Dead Sea, there's a natural system of water flowing in and evaporation out. And we have our own natural systems in terms of our climate. And then there's disruptors to those natural systems. In the Dead Sea, it's the people using the water prior to it getting to the Dead Sea, and then using the water again afterwards through the salt pans, the evaporation ponds, both of which are contributing far more than the natural systems did to lowering dead sea levels. And as a result, you're starting to see adverse and in some cases catastrophic effects near the Dead Sea. And should we be concerned that this is an allegory to us as large? We're doing things to our environment, our climate. We're driving changes larger than the natural changes, and there's going to be adverse impacts as a result of that. So, with that, let's get on with the show and the main topic that I want to talk about, which is sustaining creation and the biblical narrative, trying to look to the Bible to find why we should sustain creation. So let's talk about creation and a passage that I argue has had an enormous amount of impact on how we, at least as a Western civilization, look at creation. And so because of the history of what I'm talking about and how this goes all the way back to the Middle Ages and beyond, I'm going to read from the King James. So this is King James, Genesis 2. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over everything that moveth upon the earth. The two words that I want to focus on are subdue it and have dominion over. Those are the two critical words. I argue that that passage has had an enormous impact on the psyche of our entire civilization, our Christian civilization. And it has an impact on how we view what we can do with our property in terms of property ownership. It has had an impact on how we view animals, both domestic and wild, and extinction events, the exploitation and use of natural resources, and in essence, the basis of our entire Western economic and agricultural system. That passage gives us permission or even instructs us to subdue and have dominion. So let's look at some other translations. This is from the NIV. This is Genesis 2, again, the same passage. God blessed them and said to them, Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. And this is the NRSV. God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds in the air and over everything that moves upon the earth. Oh, there's that dominion word again. So let's go back to the Hebrew, and I know nothing of ancient Hebrew. So I got to fall back on somebody else. Here's Christopher Brown. And here's the link to his webpage where he talks about this particular issue and the translation of this text. And he seems to know what he's talking about. So let's take a look at what he has to say here. Okay, let's start with the word subdue. The first word subdue, and I'm kind of quoting him here, in Hebrew is kabash. You can't get around it. It does mean subdue or enslave, and even in the harshest instances, molest or rape. But here's the catch. It only means this when the party being subdued is already hostile. Hence it is used to speak of military enemies in Scripture. Not to subdue an attacking army would lead to death. Hence we subdue the earth, because without such subjugation, the harshness of nature would yield death for us rather than life. And now let's look at the word dominion. Okay, we use it for rule, dominion or rule. In the Hebrew, this is radah. It's a royal word. This is the dominating rule of a king. So that word, radah, this is the same word that's used in Psalm 72, verses 12 through 14. He delivers the needy when they call. the poor and those who have no helper. He has pity on the weak and needy and saves the lives of the needy. From oppression and violence he redeems their life, and precious is their blood in his sight. This is what is, at least in these verses of Psalms, is being expressed as the ideal role of a king, is to take care of those who are in need and save the lives of the needy from oppression and violence, so on and so forth. In other words, you can use this word, radah, a royal word for rule, dominion, to be used. It's your task, your mission, your role, your duty as king, to take care of those who need care. So Christopher's translation of that same text would be as follows, or is as follows: Be fruitful and have children, filling the earth with your life, so that you can have power to fight against everything in it that leads to death. Rule with care and fairness over the natural world, over the myriads of my beautiful creatures, from tropical fish to soaring eagles to dogs and cats, every creature that is part of this living world. All right. So, it's possible that you can look back to the original Hebrew text and then change the wording in such a way that it's actually supporting sustainability, that we have dominion over the earth, but if we have dominion, that comes with some degree of responsibility to sustain that earth so we can continue to gain life from it. So, now let's move on to a different section of passages, especially that of Leviticus, but we'll get to that in a minute here. Psalm 24:1, the earth is the Lord's, and all that is in it, the world and those who live in it. And then this is a little even more important in my book. We go to Leviticus 25, verse 23. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants. That's God speaking to his people through Moses. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants. In other words, there are many passages, many sections in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Testament, that argue that the earth is God's, and we are but allowed to use the earth. Think of it as being tenants. We're not allowed to own it in perpetuity. Now, others would argue that these passages are not really meant or not put together to argue for sustainability, that the people who are writing these had nothing in mind about environmental sustainability and everything in mind about economic justice. And I argue that's the case too. But I also argue that you cannot have economic justice without some degree of environmental sustainability. In other words, if you're going to level the economic playing field and have some degree of economic justice, you can't go destroying your resources so that future generations have nothing, whereas you do. That's also a form of economic justice. Oh, are we out of time? Well, looks like you just missed me going into my Think Locally, Act Globally lecture, which is arguably torturous. So, close call. So I'm going to wrap up this class here, but before I wrap up and hit the stop button on the recording here, please reach back to us. Let us know what you want to see in the future. I'm just kind of going to plow ahead and keep recording other lessons moving forward, but if there's anything that you wanted me to deal with specifically that you've seen in the past that you want me to rerun, or other issues that you may want me to try to tackle, let us know one way or the other. You know how to reach out to us at the church, and we'll see if we can accommodate, do the best we can during these troubling times. Everybody take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I look forward to speaking to you again.